Hello, and welcome to my presentation on lessons from British Columbia for Treaty in Victoria. This presentation will give background on Canadian treaty processes, look at the modern treaty process in Canada, see examples of modern-day treaties and their scopes, look at difficulties that have arisen with the Canadian treaty process, and conclude with 3 key recommendations for MOB to consider when moving forward with the treaty process in Victoria. The hope is that by providing insight into other Indigenous communities working through the difficult process of crafting modern treaties, Aboriginal Victorians can come away with ideas and inspiration to continue to work through their treaty processes. So why do we start with British Columbia? There are 3 key reasons that I chose to pull from British Columbia's treaty experience. Firstly, both countries start with the same colonial backgrounds. Both were colonized by the British and remain a part of the Commonwealth to this day. Both are currently working on modern treaty negotiations, and both are states and federal systems currently navigating the treaty process. These 3 similarities provide some shared governing experiences that have shaped the relationship between the settler state and the First Nations. Let's dive in to the historical context for treaties in Canada. Throughout the 18th to 20th century, the Crown entered into numerous treaties with Indigenous nations across what is now known as Canada. Today, Canada recognizes 70 of these historical treaties. The Treaties of Peace and Neutrality were signed between 1701 and 1760. The Peace and Friendship Treaties were signed between 1725 and 1779. The Upper Canada Land Surrenders and the Williams Treaties were signed between 1764 and 1862. The Robinson and Douglas Treaties were signed between 1850 and 1854, and the Numbered Treaties were signed between 1871 and 1921. These treaties make up the recognized historical treaties inherited by the Commonwealth of Canada from the British Crown. The earliest of these treaties, before 1763, were signed with the intention of the British to gain the alliances of native nations for trade and strategic military purposes. Zooming out to the larger global historical context, Britain and France were engaged in a race for territory and alliance in the New World. With conflict always looming between these 2 world powers, both sought to sign treaties with native nations to strengthen their positions in the Americas. War did eventually come to the colonies. The 7 Years' War, also referred to as the French and Indian War, began in 1754 and ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. From this war, the British were the winners, and their victory claimed ownership of previously French-occupied colonies in Canada and the Americas. In 1763, King George III issued a proclamation preventing Western settlement of so-called Indian lands that had been previously claimed by the French. This proclamation is argued to support the claims for Indigenous land titles in Canada. It is also important to note that the Canadian Constitution also affirms land rights and title of Native nations. Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution outlines the basis for what has developed into the modern treaty-making process in Canada. This section outlines the Aboriginal Canadians are entitled to treaty rights that include land claims. In 1973, the Canadian Supreme Court ruled in Calder v. British Columbia, recognizing Indigenous rights. This decision forced British Columbia to the treaty table. Since then, British Columbia has signed 4 treaties with 8 nations. These treaties are the Nisga'a Final Agreement, the Tasawasan First Nation Final Agreement, the Manalth First Nations Final Agreement, which includes 5 independent Indigenous governments, and the Tla'amin Final Agreement. British Columbia, however, has a unique process to other Canadian provinces, as their treaties are brokered by an independent commission called the British Columbia Treaty Commission. This commission brings together stakeholders and helps to negotiate deals between British Columbia and their native nation counterparts. The British Columbia Treaty Commission's mission is to act independently to lobby and advocate for reconciliation and self-determination through negotiations of modern treaties and reconciliation agreements. They educate and raise knowledge and understanding of the benefits of modern treaties and self-governments, allocate funding to First Nations to support negotiations, dedicate resources to treaty making through effective facilitation of nation-to-nation negotiations. Some of these aspects are already being reflected in the Victorian Treaty Framework, advocated by the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, which has been pushing for a self-determination fund and an independent treaty authority. The British Columbia Treaty Commission has outlined a 6-step process for treaty negotiation. First, a statement of intent to negotiate. Second, a readiness to negotiate. Third, a negotiation of a framework agreement. 4, a negotiation of an agreement in principle. 5, a negotiation to finalize the treaty. And finally, an implementation of the treaty. And while this may seem like a simple 6-step program, some of these steps in themselves take years, if not decades, to complete. Treaty processes are often slow-moving, but while it may take decades to negotiate, its impact may last for centuries. Now let's take a look at one of these treaties brokered by the British Columbia Treaty Commission with the Tuolumne Nation. This treaty is almost 250 pages and covers a wide range of governing issues, from taxation and enrollment to roads and environment. The role of this treaty is to codify what the Tuolumne have known since time immemorial, that they have a right to self-governance in their territory. There have been notable setbacks with some of the treaty negotiations. Firstly, governments are political entities, which means that at both the British Columbia level and the Native Nation level, there is a possible turnover every election cycle that can put delays on the treaty process. Depending on the results of the elections, treaty negotiations can be reversed or significantly changed. If treaty negotiations take longer periods of time, there's also a threat of government employee turnover, which can delay treaty negotiations while new staff is being brought up to speed on the treaty process. Secondly, these processes can cost a lot of time and money from both the Native Nation and the state government. The lack of sufficient funding or attention can also be a factor in stalling treaty negotiations. Finally, community education. Sometimes, once the stakeholder from Native nations go back to their nations for approval and ratification of these treaties, they face a steep curve of catching up community on all the work they have done in negotiating these treaties. This is why it is important to keep community updated and informed on treaty negotiations as they happen. So what are some key takeaways from British Columbia treaty negotiations with their Native nations that Mob here in Victoria can learn from? Firstly, focus on keeping community educated and involved in the treaty process. Making sure that community is on the same page as those at the negotiations table is crucial to making sure that whatever treaty finally comes out of these delegations, it actually reflects the needs and desires of the community it seeks to cover. The First Peoples Assembly of Victoria is already doing a lot of community outreach work, but leaders can always do more to connect with those they represent. Secondly, focus on building capacity by educating the next generation of both Native Nation leaders and public servants. When every person comes to the table with some educational background in Indigenous governance, this will significantly speed up treaty process negotiations. This can look like partnering with local universities and schools to introduce some introduction to Indigenous governance classes. For those who are aspiring public servants or Indigenous leaders, this could also look like hosting training courses that specialize in getting aspiring, new, or current leaders up to speed on the importance of Indigenous governance and the treaty process. The final suggestion is to work on building long-lasting political relationships with politicians in every party, so no matter who is elected, the work does not stop. It is important to have a serious focus on lobbying the government and building these relationships to improve the relational power of Native nations in government. This step works to ensure that no matter who wins the next election, they will allow the ball to keep rolling for self-determination. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that from this video you were able to take away some valuable lessons on comparative Indigenous governance between the treaty processes in British Columbia and Victoria.